In the second part of today's Mastering Xert lesson, I'm going to spend some time answering the question, what is maximum power available? And just like in the last section, I'll first start by explaining the concept of MPA via the presentation, and then we'll jump into the Xert software once again for some demonstrations. I want to start off by saying that the concept of MPA is actually extremely intuitive. You and I both know that MPA exists even before Xert. For example, I want you to think about the most power that you could produce over 10 seconds when you're warmed up and you're ready to do an all-out sprint effort. And I want you to compare that power that you can produce over those 10 seconds to the second example where I have you ride all out for 5 minutes, and at the end of that 5-minute effort, I ask you to stand up and sprint as hard as you can for 10 seconds. You and I both know intuitively that the amount of power that you're going to produce for those two 10-second sprints, it's going to be much higher when you're not fatigued in the first example. And you're going to produce much less power in the second example. Why? Because you're fatigued. That 5-minute effort, it induced a lot of fatigue on your legs. And so when you go to sprint at the end of that effort, you're not able to generate as much power. I want to help illustrate the feeling of riding next to MPA, next here. And so I want you to think back to before you joined Xert, back when you were doing FTP tests. And I want you to think about the first minute or so of that 20-minute effort. I know for myself personally, and we'll see it in just a little bit, I know I felt really optimistic and I felt good and the adrenaline's pumping and I'm doing above what I was anticipating for 20 minutes because I'm feeling so good. And then 5 minutes later, your legs are burning and your lungs are burning, you're breathing hard, and you're like, why am I doing this to myself? And then I want you to think to that last 5 minutes, that last 1 minute, the last 30 seconds of that 20-minute effort. And your legs just feel like they're on fire, and you finish that effort, and you just can't pedal any harder. If you've ever gone through that experience, you know what it's like to ride at your maximum power available. You couldn't pedal any harder because you were riding right at your limit. And that's exactly what MPA means. And that's why we gave it the name maximum power available. Like the name suggests, it represents exactly how much power you can produce at any moment in time. What's important to understand about MPA is that the value of MPA is actually dynamic. It changes over the course of your ride. When you start an activity, you might notice that your MPA is up at some high value. And it's actually going to be equal to what we call your peak power or your highest sprinting power. We're going to talk about that in the next section. But when you start an activity, the assumption for the most power that you can produce, or your MPA, is that the most power you can produce is equal to the highest sprint power you have. And so that's why when you start an activity, your MPA is going to be equal to your high sprint power. But as you start going through your activity, and if you start doing some intervals, some hard intervals, you'll notice that your MPA will start to come down as you fatigue. And when you hit your recovery intervals, you'll notice your MPA goes back up. Xert's able to calculate and show exactly how much power you can produce in real time. And we show it in the Xert EBC app. We show it on the Garmin MPA data field, on the Hammerhead, the Hammerhead Karoo MPA data field can show you exactly how much power you can produce in real time. So it's really amazing. One way to tie back in the previous example that we talked about, so if you remember our bench pressing athlete, after his weight training program, remember he could bench press 250 pounds once, and then he could bench press 110 pounds 20 times. One way to think about the concept of MPA is to kind of answer this question. So when he's doing his 20 reps, how many more reps could that athlete do of 110 pounds after doing 20 of them? Well, the answer is 0. We know he couldn't do any more repetitions. Why? Because he only did 20 repetitions. And so we could, to kind of put this in that analogy, we could calculate the maximum bench available for that athlete as being equal to 110 pounds at that 20th rep. If it was more than 110 pounds, he would be able to do yet another repetition. And so what's important kind of to understand from that analogy is that MPA isn't something that just Xert made up and it comes out of a black box, but this concept of there being some sort of maximal power that you can generate at any point in time actually scales to other sports as well. But with road cycling, we've actually been able to calculate and display exactly how much power you can produce intermittently. And this is all based on the power data from your power meter and what we call in Xert your fitness signature. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section. But like I said, it's important to understand MPA represents how much power you can produce at any moment in time, and that it is something that is going to be unique to Xert. So no other platform is actually able to calculate exactly how much power you can produce at any moment in time. And what's even cooler, I get so excited about this, what's even cooler is that not only do we know the maximum amount of power that you can produce, but we actually know how long it will take you to recover. We know how long you could hold, let's say 400 watts. Interactively, as you fatigue and as you recover, we can actually show you. We have time to exhaustion and time to recovery. We know all of these things based on how hard you're riding. We can calculate exactly to the second when you're going to fatigue and when you'll be recovered. And we use a lot of that information in a lot of our smart workouts. It's really amazing. The last comment that I have here, and we're going to see this in just a moment, is that MPA, once you understand how MPA works, MPA helps tell a story of your activities, and you can use it to help take your analysis, your race analysis or your activity analysis really to the next level. So what I want to do now is I want to jump back into the Xert software and I want to do another demonstration showing the activity details page and then further illustrating what MPA is and kind of how to do an MPA analysis. So let's jump to the Xert software. All right, we're going to jump back into the Xert software here. What I've done for this section is I've picked a couple of my activities from my years in Xert, and we're going to use them, first of all, to show you how the activity details page works, what some of the information is on it, and then I want to show you how you can start to do an MPA analysis of your activities. So you can really start to get that extra level of analysis from Xert. On the activity details page, you'll notice the very basic information on the top left. You'll have a ride summary. Sometimes if you get a breakthrough, so for this FTP test, I got a bronze breakthrough. And if I click on that, I can actually generate a breakthrough report. And I have these synced to go to Strava automatically. So when this ride gets uploaded to Xert and it syncs from Xert to Strava, this image actually gets pushed to Strava right away. Which is a really nice feature. But if you don't have that enabled, you can manually download those and upload them to Strava if you'd like that way. Next to that, we'll show you actually any changes in your fitness signature. Once again, we'll talk about fitness signatures in just a little bit. Beneath that is the title of the activity, the date and time of the activity, as well as the difficulty rating. In addition to renaming the activity, if you click the little pencil there, you can favorite the activity or flag the activity. So if there's errors in your power meter data, you can flag the activity from here. On the top right hand side, you'll have some of the Xert specific metrics. I won't spend time on focus and specificity. Those are a little bit beyond the scope of today's video. But note that if you do have either a breakthrough or a fake through, you can see the maximal effort time in this portion of the activity details screen. Working down a little bit farther, you'll see the MPA software analytics beneath this. And it'll start off by having 4 horizontal bars with 2 numbers on each. These 2 numbers represent the average and the maximum value for power, speed, cadence, and heart rate. Beneath those 4 metrics, you'll see a series of other related metrics, so distance, how much climbing you did, how much work was performed, etc. What's really helpful about Xert is that on the chart beneath this, we call this the MPA chart, you can actually click and drag specific regions of your activity, and all the stats up here will change to reflect that. So if I want to highlight this little warm-up portion before the FTP test, so if I click and drag that, you'll see all these stats up here will update. So for my 4-minute and 51-second selection, the average power was 280, max was 389. For example, you can see how many kilojoules of work were performed. If you want to change this selection, you can either move the sliders here on the left and right hand side. So you can slide them left or right. Or if you would like to see the entire activity, you can click the zoom out button and it will take you back to the entire activity. Now for the actual MPA analysis, I wanted to show you this chart beneath. Xert does also analyze heart rate, cadence, altitude or elevation, and those can be viewed underneath. So by default, your heart rate is hidden, but if you would like to see heart rate, you can click to enable it and you'll see your red heart rate. You can also click to show perhaps the elevation. There's no elevation on this ride, it was an indoor, but if I want to see cadence, I can see my cadence throughout the activity, for example, and just clicking and clicking them again will either show or hide them. In terms of the MPA analysis, as I was saying earlier, when you start an activity, your MPA is going to start at a very high value, and it's going to start at what we call your peak power, or your highest sprint power. And what you'll notice is that as long as I ride below my threshold power, think of that as being analogous to your FTP. Once again, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But when I ride below my threshold power, my MPA stays elevated. So as I do these couple of warm-ups and as I do this warm-up, which was still generally below threshold, you'll notice my MPA stays elevated. But what you'll notice is that as soon as I start this 20-minute effort, my MPA starts to decrease. And it actually comes down, we would call it exponentially. You'll notice the first 5 minutes, even though my average power over the first 5 minutes is pretty constant, MPA only comes down about 40 watts over 5 minutes. But what you'll notice is that over the next 5 minutes, MPA comes down about 200 watts. And I distinctly remember doing this FTP test, and I hit the halfway point. I've got my music blaring, and like the meme said before, like my legs were straight up not having a good time. And actually at the halfway point, I shifted down. I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to hold that power for the whole activity. And so I shifted into an easier gear, and you'll see it's illustrated by the color green here. It's hard to see, but I'm actually below my threshold at that point. And so that would actually be considered recovering. I'm riding below my threshold. I'm getting rid of some of the fatigue that I've built up. And you'll actually see that MPA recovers because of that. So you see MPA goes from 751 all the way back up to 780, 776. So I rested for about 2 minutes. While I was still working hard, it didn't feel like resting, but I was quote unquote resting there for 2 minutes while MPA recovered, and then I started pushing hard again. You notice I started getting worried that I was going to bonk or that I was going to end too soon, and so I shifted easier again. You see MPA recover a little bit before that final 3-minute push. And at the very end of that effort, I'm able to bring my MPA all the way down to my power output, and I'm able to push through for that breakthrough. And you'll see that after that effort, that as I ride once again below threshold, you'll see my MPA shoots right back up as I ride nice and easy to recover after that effort. And so in general, what you'll notice is that when you ride above your threshold power, or this red dashed line, when you ride above that, MPA comes down. And when you ride below that, your MPA, if it's down, goes back up. So that's in general how you can do a very simple MPA analysis. And I like this because it shows a nice clean example of how MPA comes down and how MPA goes back up. But most often, most of your activities don't have any sort of just set 20-minute effort, unless it's a 20-minute FTP test or if it's a time trial. A lot of times your data is much more stochastic, as we might say. It's much more perhaps random. And so I have another example here. This is in our workout library. We call it Test Your Mite. This is one that you can use for breakthroughs. But this workout consists of alternating segments of 30 seconds on and 30 seconds off. And what you'll notice on a quick glance here is that each of these 30-second efforts on, these big, tall, orange efforts, really draws my MPA down. But as I shift into an easier gear and as I recover for 30 seconds in between these, you'll see MPA goes back up. And so you get this very jagged or like sawtooth profile on this activity. So if I click and drag to highlight over this region, you can see this very clearly. As I pedal and work hard, MPA comes down. And as I shift and recover and ride nice and easy for 30 seconds, MPA goes back up. And I brought this all the way to the point, I remember in this workout too, this is another workout that I distinctly remember, where these two efforts, they weren't the last two, it was, I guess the 6 to go and 5 to go, where I felt like I was absolutely at my limit. I couldn't push any harder. And sure enough, they correspond with right where I was right at my limit for MPA. And so MPA can be used to analyze both kind of these steady state efforts like we saw in the 20-minute example, or they can do these intermittent intervals. So this 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. In addition to both of those, you can also use MPA analysis on race data. And so I have an example here. This was a crit from the Tour of America's Dairyland series, Toad. Maybe some of you have heard of it. I'm not huge into crit racing, but this was a local race in Grafton, Wisconsin, and I wanted to test out my fitness and give crits a try. As you can see from the graph here, the crit consisted of a 6-corner course. And essentially what happened, you can see from this wicked MPA line, is I sat at the back end of the lead group, which led to some what we call yo-yoing. So into each of the corners as people coast, and as you break into the corner, everybody bunches up. But as soon as you exit the corner, you sprint quite a bit. And you have to sprint, especially if you're at the tail end. You have to sprint to catch the wheel of the person in front of you. Otherwise, you're going to get dropped. And so what you can see from this is that these hard sprints really drained my MPA. And so if I zoom in here, the hard sprints drain the MPA, but coasting back into the corners actually allows my MPA to recover. And you can see even by 7.5 minutes into the race, I was almost at my limit. Unfortunately, there was a crash in this race. So hopefully that person ended up being okay. Hopefully they're back on their bike now, but there was a little bit of a break in the ride before we were able to continue. And so that's what the little break in the middle is. But I distinctly remember restarting the race, and after I think 2 or 3 laps, I was pretty much at my limit. So you'll see here, I did get a breakthrough on this activity, but this was a learning experience for me not to sit on the back of that lead pack, but me just trying to hang on to a wheel, I was at my limit. I got a breakthrough. So Xert updated my fitness signature, and I believe my peak power went up almost 100 watts from this activity. My threshold was unchanged, but I simply wasn't able to keep up with the front row anymore after this effort. And so the MPA shows it. The MPA came down, and even if I wanted to sprint any harder out of these intervals, you can see that I didn't have much more than about 850 watts or so coming out of each of those turns. And the lead group was probably continuing to do 1,000+ watts out of those corners. And so for me, this becomes very clear that even if I wanted to pedal harder, I wouldn't be able to do it. I needed more sprinting power. So, but something that Xert allows me to do here is it allows me to see this MPA data. If I wasn't able to see the MPA data, this is what I might see in Strava or in some other platforms. I might just see how much power I produced. It doesn't put how much power I produced in context of how much power I could produce. And so when viewing my power with MPA, now I can start to analyze and I can see exactly where I failed, and it just helps clarify perhaps why I failed at this point in the race, and why I tapered off at the back end of the race, why I wasn't able to stick with the front group. Well, it's because I became limited by my MPA. If I want to stick with them, I have to be either more fit or I have to be smarter about how I use my power. Hopefully I've helped illustrate how the activities details page works, showing you some of the features of it, as well as showing you how you can do an MPA analysis on your own activities. I'm going to jump back into the PowerPoint real quick, just to recap what we've talked about with MPA. Remember that fatigue affects your ability to produce power, so as your legs get tired, they can't work as hard. We know this, and Xert calculates it as MPA. Remember, your maximum power available represents the most power that you can produce at any moment in time. And it's a dynamic value. As you fatigue, your MPA comes down, and as you recover, it goes back up. Lastly, remember that only Xert can calculate your MPA. This is the only platform where we can show you exactly how much power you can produce, and we can actually do it in real time. So try out the MPA data fields for Garmin, on Xert EBC, on the Karoo. Give them a shot sometime. MPA is something that distinguishes Xert from perhaps other platforms that you might have used, and it's something that draws a lot of people to the platform. That's it for our section on MPA. We're going to finish today's lesson by wrapping everything together by talking about fitness signatures.